A note of warning. This podcast explores graphic and disturbing stories and includes strong language. It therefore may not be suitable for our young listeners or other folks who may find it disturbing.
Welcome to True Crime Daily, the podcast, The Web Extra. And we're here with Amaryllis Fox. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me.
Welcome.
So you just wrote this book, and it's called Life Undercover. Tell us what it's about.
Well, it's really a personal coming-of-age story, but I happened to come of age not only against the backdrop of the war on terror, but while undercover working counterterrorism for CIA overseas, and got married and had my daughter while I was doing that work. And so, you know, in some ways, it's a story of figuring out who I was and what my work was in the world in the way that every 20-something-year-old does. And then at a kind of more macro level, it's the story of the war on terror through the eyes of the 20-somethings who were fighting it at the agency. And I think sometimes we forget how young the intelligence and military officers who are tasked with this work are, especially in the intelligence world. The longer that you're out working, the more your cover gets eroded. So the kind of counterintuitive thing.
Do you mind explaining that?
Sure. So, you know, I remember a teacher saying to me during training, you can do an entire career sitting in your closet overseas and not do any work, and your cover will be pristine. Nobody will suspect that you work at CIA or that you're involved in the intelligence world, but you also won't have done anything useful. You know, so every time you embark on an operation, you develop a source, you do something to try to predict or prevent an act of war, an act of terrorism. The chance of the people around you getting some sense of what you do increases, so that eventually, after several tours, most people end up either being declared to the country that they're working in or coming back and working at headquarters, taking on a management role. So it's really the first tour officers, the youngest people whose cover is pristine because they haven't been out working, that are often tasked with work that requires that level of secrecy. And so this is the story of the development in many ways of my sort of perspective on the war on terror. I did not start out with a view to peacemaking or finding common ground. I'd lost a friend to terrorism in third grade. My writing hero, Danny Pearl, was killed after 9/11. I had really been shaken by what was happening to the world and started out wanting to wipe the adversary off the playing field. And I just learned interaction after interaction over the course of almost a decade that just doesn't work. I mean, it's not only not a very fulfilling way to live, but you risk creating more adversaries than you destroy.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the book is that evolution, but in a very personal sense. I think a lot of people who read it feel like they've had many of the same experiences, just not working at the agency.
Yeah. So, you know, you have the Inside Jacket blurbs, and I just want to read, you know, that tries to get somebody that is in a bookstore as they pick this up and they go through it. All right, well, what's this book about? And this is the hook. As the book opens, Amaryllis is alone navigating the back alleys of Karachi as she prepares to negotiate with terrorists to avoid deployment of a nuclear device. And it's like, already you've blown every other, no pun intended, every other book that's next to you out of the water. How, the reader wonders, did she come to be here in a dark room in Pakistan surrounded by men who could just as easily kill her as cooperate with her requests? So that's pretty awesome right there. And the stakes don't get much higher than that.
The thing is, this work happens around the world every day with intelligence officers, you know, and that's what we forget. And the other thing that we forget is that in every one of those meetings, the stakes are potentially enormous in the way that you can tell from that blurb. They're also potentially not high at all, in that so many of the threats that get reported turn out to either not be real or involve a scam where the arms dealer was actually just selling dud goods for his own enrichment, or the technology is too old to work, or the terror group doesn't have the right technologists on their team to actually know how to make it work. So in many cases, the threat that's reported feels like it would be an end of the world. And the only time that we know really the outcome of one of these operations is when it fails because
Right.
the attack happens, right? But we can never really say they're successful. I mean, even that example in the book, you get to the point where the thing doesn't go boom, but it could have been for any of those reasons I just said. It could have been a false threat to begin with,
to say some disinformation.
Disinformation, poor technology, or a new target can be acquired. The attack can be delayed for some strategic or kind of logistical reason. So you can never really say like, great job done, crisis averted.
How do you get a sense of fulfillment or satisfaction then when you know that you're kind of digging a hole in the sand?
I don't know that there's a lot of sense of satisfaction that's associated with this kind of work. It's more the fear of not doing it, right? The notion, especially once you have a little person. Once I had my daughter, who's this kind of tiny embodiment of every risk and every hope for the future and tomorrow, and also the mothers and the babies on all sides of the conflict, not just ours. So it's more not being able to step back from the chance to make some small inroads, even if you're never going to know whether the sand has fallen in on them. And I remember actually when I left, my kind of mentor there saying, you did great, but don't worry, this place is like a swimming pool. When people leave, the water fills in behind them and no one ever even remembers they're here. And it's this notion of service that's handed from one person to the next so that no person is indispensable.
Right. It's I don't want to use the word thankless, but yes, you've just saved this thing or prevented a thing or gotten some great intelligence for a thing, but there's always the next thing. Yeah, so it's that's the dedication. You have to keep that in mind.
That's a question that I got on my tour every day was, how are you, is it satisfying or how do you get satisfied? And you can't, because there's so many other murders that are out there. There's 5,000 unsolved murders every year, and after I worked and solved, my half a dozen plus, helped solve another 4 more. So I helped do 10. And then, Golden State Killer was 13. So that was seriously. And I after Golden State Killer, it was like, wow. And then after it was like, wow, we got 23. And then I'm just such a numbers guy just from having grown up like collecting baseball cards and stuff. It's like, that's 23 versus 220,000.
On the other hand, though, if not you, somebody's got to do it. So there's that dedication. It does obviously self-select for that.
I think it's day by day, one by one.
Yeah. Well, the other question I always get, which I'd like to ask you, is that when you were undercover, what did you do to relax? Like, what did you do to unplug?
Well, I mean, the challenge, especially when you're overseas, is that it's really a 24/7 reality, and it's a little bit of a kind of nesting doll in that, different people at different levels in your life have sort of some glimpse of the truth or no glimpse of the truth. And so that matrix is kind of there all the time. So even when you are relaxing, you're relaxing within something of a Truman Show, really. And it's what makes now in post-service life these little tiny moments I just treasure so much. I have a tattoo on the inside of my wrist that says, "This too shall pass," which I think most people kind of say to you when something really bad is happening. Yeah. And for me, I have it there because in these quiet moments when I'm reading to my daughters, life goes so quickly, and these beautiful glimpses of just being still and being fulfilled and having such a wonderful family now and being able to enjoy it. I think I maybe wouldn't appreciate quite so much if I hadn't had those years of not having a lot of opportunity to relax.
So were you able to go to, say, I mean, you're in your 20s, and when you look at everybody else that's in their 20s that potentially would have been your counterparts, were going to bars, going to clubs.
Oh, totally.
Going to movies,
I remember going to a music festival for the first time in maybe 30, 31 years old and just being like, this is what you guys have all been doing? What was I thinking? But it was really nice to get to just deeply appreciate every one of those experiences in a way that, I probably wouldn't have if I had just kind of launched straight from school into them. And to be able to take the tools that I had learned in my 20s for this very specific purpose and then use them in different ways. That's a lot of what I do now is kind of sharing these tools of how to listen to people who disagree with us, maybe even want to kill us, which seems to be increasingly prevalent even here in our politics at home, and really create dialogue with the people that we fear. And getting to do that now kind of feels worth those years sacrificed in my 20s.
To kind of reflect on what you were saying a little bit, as far as obviously you can't talk any operational details about what you were doing and where you were and things like that, but the counterpoint of the 25-year-old who's not an agent and who's going to music festivals and bars and whatever else, but you're 25 and you're in, say, Pakistan, or you're in Bulgaria, or whatever the case might be, you still have to fit in with other 25-year-olds there. I'm a visiting student. I'm whatever I am, whatever the case may be. Your targets aren't necessarily always going to be 25-year-olds unless, this person works at that radio station or whatever. But so some of these things are like, you have to still be able to get drunk like a 25-year-old back home, but you also have to keep your head on straight and be very directed on. I mean, that's got to be exhausting.
It's definitely ordering drinks and then not having alcohol in yours is kind of par for the course, right? Where you allow people around you. Yeah. I mean, I think that's sensible, even if you're in an important business meeting.
But doesn't that raise like if the bartender there? So are you basically a teetotaler? You're saying, I'm a...
you grab some kind of a club soda that can look like a gin and tonic.
Club soda with lime and a swizzle stick.
But there are times where, you're having drinks right alongside them. One of the areas that I never envied were the folks that worked in more Latin America type areas, because
drinking culture.
It's not only a drinking culture, but in many of the groups that needed to be penetrated, they're also a heavy drug culture. And
so you got to be able to.
Well, it's just like if you were stationed, say, in Russia. And then it's like, all right, we're drinking vodka, shots, whatever. It's just like, how do you fake that?
They're
you can't
pouring
fake it.
for you. No, I mean, it's an immersive job in many ways. I think, luckily, working in the Middle East, there is definitely plenty of drinking in the Middle East under the table, but for the most part, it is, obviously less of a drinking culture.
Right.
And along with that, particularly in the Middle East, that's brings up some issues, but in general. And I'm sure that I haven't had a chance to read this yet, but I'm sure some of this is addressed. There's sort of the history of the CIA goes back to World War II, and then after World War II is the Cold War, and you've got kind of Ivy League guys that they selected from Yale and Harvard,
the best and the brightest in that
Oxford
era,
when they're going over to Britain. But yeah, the best and the brightest. You think of Kennedy years and things like that, but very much a Tweedy. Blue blood, East Coast, someone who might be wealthy, speaks a couple of languages, that kind of thing. Different type of training, different type of demographic versus now. So, get into the female thing, but also after 9/11, the technology thing, it's much more of a militarization of the CIA and kill teams and things like that, plus signals intelligence and less emphasis on the human intelligence. This is all open source stuff that I've read in the news.
Yeah.
You can speak to it. But then on top of that, for instance, you had a kid while you were basically in the field. Is that right?
Yeah.
So that's Brave New World stuff.
One of the real challenges is that legacy of kind of rich white dudes doing this work. And, there are some rich white dudes who, probably despite that rather than because of it are good at their job. But the need for more women, more people of color, people from diverse backgrounds to join this world or be of service in one of many different ways. This is not the only national security role that desperately needs people from diverse backgrounds. And I think in part because we don't see those archetypes on the Hollywood screen, young people don't think of this as a calling for them. But the emotional complexity of this work of relationship building actually lends itself terribly well to feminine approaches to problem solving. Emotional intelligence, intuition, multitasking.
Not everything is a nail.
Yeah.
And there's that great scene in Charlie Wilson's War, where Philip Seymour Hoffman is just like, remember that? Remember when he breaks the window on John Slattery? And he's just like, I thought it would be a good idea for spies to actually speak the languages of the people they're spying on.
And that was coming out of the 80s.
Yeah, exactly. That was coming right out of the 80s, and exactly what you're saying. And, it was, I think we kind of, did you see that after, would people say who were there prior to 2001, once we got that awful wake-up call. It was like, yeah, we should do that. We should have.
I think there was definitely an awareness right away that we should do that. Doing it is, of course, always a more complicated matter because it's sort of also turning a battleship around. But there, from a security perspective, there were all of these concerns around, after 9/11 in the kind of haze of everything. Yes, we need these applicants, but how do we screen
people that speak Arabic may be suspect?
Exactly.
In the first 6 months of this, they need all that background, right?
And so I think there were challenges there that held back the organization enormously. Yeah. And those even in the time that I was there were certainly overcome. And I think the younger generation of officers, those that have most excelled, I think, have come from all of these diverse backgrounds. And women have done so well there in the years since I've left. Now not just the director, but all of the leaders of the directorates beneath her are all women for the first time in CIA history, which is so exciting as a kind of reflection of the agency's role in peacemaking going forward and maybe moving away from that kind of diversion post 9/11 where they moved more into the paramilitary world rather than focusing on their core competence, which is human intelligence.
Human intelligence.
I'm struck again. I mean, another movie example, but Zero Dark 30, in which the Maya character is basically the hero and gets the job done here. That kind of resistance, though, I have to think that in the first 5 to 10, just knowing human nature, especially old boys networks and things like that, that you're going to get a lot of resistance from just a girl, or you've only been doing this for 2 years, or you're not in the field in the same way. I
definitely experienced that in the early days, for sure. And some of it I put in the book, some of it I left out because it was crude and crass and ultimately irrelevant, because the evolution really has begun there, and I think not just begun, but really taken off. I mean, we've seen not just that change in leadership, but I think even by the time that I left, which is a decade ago now, more and more of the women that were excelling in the field, not just in management, more and more of those officers were women. So
you talk about the Hollywood depictions, and then you go from the Hollywood depictions of, and then of the old-timey type spies. And then you get a show like, say, Homeland, where it's just like, okay, you've got a strong female character, but then they compromise her. They compromise her and mentally ill and morally suspect too, because she's sleeping with her subjects and everything. And it's just
which is one of the sort of themes in Hollywood that drives me crazy. You not only, whether you're a man or a woman, are forbidden from having any relationship with not just a source, but any foreign national. But in certain circumstances, you can not only be fired, but you can be prosecuted criminally for it. Yeah. So the idea that, women who are good at this work are good for
honeypots,
exactly,
honey
it's
traps,
just infuriating.
I mean, so you got James Bond, I guess, but then you get Homeland that started with that. There's going to be a Black Widow movie. So in the Marvel universe, which is the biggest money-making thing, and that's going to be that too.
The implication also is that, especially in everything from Burn Notice on television to all the way across the thing, is that you sort of have to have a moral screw loose to work in the. You have to get dirty. You have to have.
And it's
this
actually
sort of
it's so frustrating because entertainment can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Right. We hit what we look at, is what they say in the defensive driving course, and it applies to this as well, which is this idea that, we recruit the very archetypes that see themselves on the screen and then therefore think that this is their calling. And what I often say to people is those that are least likely to find personal happiness doing this kind of work are exactly the ones that we need. Not people who are signing up because it looks cool or because they're going to get off on the power trip. Or it's the same as what we need in our police force and others, where it's actually the loneliness, the responsibility, the moral weight on your shoulders, making it a really tough year, decade, however many years your service is of your life. That's the service part of service,
Fortitude.
And then you can go on and have a different phase in your life. But anyone who kind of grows up thinking like that would be cool, maybe it's actually not the right role for them.
That was me, but I outgrew it. By the time I was in college, it was sort of like, I actually was interested in the Foreign Service, but even that was sort of like, I don't think I have the right lineup for this. And kudos to people that do. I mean, this is service in a different way than the military is, but it's in a sense almost more immersive in some ways. Not to create any cross-field
no, and there's so much
there.
cooperation between the two communities. That's actually one of the most wonderful things about serving in either, I think, is the kind of brother and sisterhood that is shared between them.
All right. So the book is called Life Undercover. And where can they find more information about you?
Amaryllisfox.com, Instagram and Twitter. I'm not always the most diligent on socials. It's kind of a new realm for me.
You're not checking into a particular restaurant.
Extremely online.
But I have a few exciting projects coming out, but I have to wait to share them. But there is some documentary series that I will come back and chat to you about because they will be right up your alley in the next few months.
That's excellent. The book is called Life Undercover, Coming of Age in the CIA. That's Amaryllis Fox. And also I did read that Vogue article with the excerpt of that. You can check that out immediately, but buy this on Penguin Books or Amazon
or at your local
else.
bookshop.
Yes, take your physical self to the physical bookstore.
Get down to those local bookshops.
So, we'll include all that details in our informational sections and check it out.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for inviting me, guys. It's fun.